Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, we're going to be discussing a topic that I've always wanted to talk about on this channel, which is the discussion of how exactly does gravity training work in Dragon Ball Z and the greater Dragon Ball franchise. And joining me today in this video is someone who's new to the channel, but I'm sure you've seen some of his content in the past. His name is Plague of Gripes. How are you doing today?
Hello everyone. Some of my content maybe you don't want to admit to having seen before, but you probably have seen it at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely check it out. He's made some great stuff over the years, and he's only going to continue to make even more great stuff moving forward. But I really wanted to have you on this video because of the fact that when it comes to doing in-depth analysis of Dragon Ball, and whether it be in videos or even sometimes I see you commenting on some of my own videos, you seem to have a very strong, firm grasp on really how the in-universe mechanics and the various aspects of everything work. So I think that you're the perfect person for me to talk about this topic with, because you bring a lot of interesting points of perspective, especially some of them we've talked beforehand when it comes to this topic. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that.
Yes, I have not made that much Dragon Ball specific content because I do so much diverse stuff. The thing that I'm most proud of probably would be the Gohan's Mini Mass video. If you want to check that out, that's one thing that I'll recommend.
Yeah, I'll put it in the top right corner.
Thank you. You might run out of those by the end of this video.
I'm sure I will.
The thing that you've probably seen the most of, though, would probably be the power levels or stupid video or something. Which This video you probably could call power levels are actually genius by the end of it, because that might be what we end up leading into. I'm going to try to make more Dragon Ball content in the future, and the reason why I was interested in this and you is because we think on such a similar wavelength, and our understanding, the way that we theorize about this stuff seems to mesh very well together.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's another reason I saw some of your comments in my videos. I was like, wow, you know, this guy gets it, or at least, you know, he seems to line up with the way I think. So hopefully that means I get it. But either way, I want to get into this because there's just so much to talk about with regard to this topic. And so I want to pop over into the manga right now, because you guys know I love to talk about the manga on here. The original version that Toriyama created, although we definitely will be talking about some other variations, be in the anime or even in Dragon Ball Super. So let's start with actually something that I think is very akin to gravity training, which also goes into the characters utilizing weighted training, because in a lot of the sense, these two things are intrinsically linked, and I believe that comes down to the concept itself of ki. So you've talked about this at length before. When it comes to the way that the characters are actually lifting these things, they aren't necessarily just using some kind of vague super strength which they inherit from their muscles and physiology, but rather through the example of ki. So is there anything that you could elaborate on with regard to that?
Yes. Whenever we were putting this together, one of our first thoughts was, or my first thought was, weight is mass times gravity. So it's very useful to look at weighted clothing as well, not just the gravity chambers themselves. And the way that ki seems to function in Dragon Ball is in some fictional settings, the characters are just strong. They're just physically stronger. There might be an explanation, maybe there's not. But in the context of Dragon Ball, it seems like the characters more or less are ordinary people in some sense, but the ki is the thing that actually amplifies the traits of whatever is contained within it. And for most things, that is just whatever they are as living life forms. Whether it is Goku, whether it's Krillin, whether it's Mr. Satan. They all have ki, and they all utilize it to different degrees.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that we could actually bring that up a little bit too, especially with reference to Mr. Satan and also his daughter, because when it comes to ki and the explanation therein, we don't really get a very detailed explanation of how it works. Essentially, in the Buu saga, we see that Videl is, you know, essentially blackmailing Gohan into training her how to use these different powers. However, when he starts to talk about how to use abilities like the Bukujutsu, how to fly, and about ki control, she has no idea exactly what this even is. And so when Goten shows her the ki blast that he utilizes to destroy this rock over here, she starts to get more of a visual idea, but she also, like Mr. Satan, is under this false pretense that it's actually a trick. However, Eventually, largely off screen, it seems like Gohan does in fact teach her more about this with regard to everyone already has ki intrinsically within them, which goes into those Eastern beliefs and ideals that Toriyama kind of pulls from. But simultaneously, when they learn how to control it, this is when Videl actually is able to not only augment her strength greatly comparative to what it used to be, but also is able to learn how to fly. So with regard to that, we talked about this a little bit off the air, but do you think that chi and ki in Toriyama's work isn't really explained too in depth because he assumes that the audience already knows and understands it? Or do you think it's more of a idea to where he's not, someone like Togashi, for example, who will explain everything to exhaustive amounts of information?
I've joked about it in prior videos, the idea that there has been no explanation of this, and this scene is in particular one of the only times where we really get anyone tutorializing a human being on how ki actually works. And Gohan really doesn't even explain anything. He just says that it is an energy that is within your core and you utilize it. And when Videl says no, that is not the case, he just tells her to keep trying, and then eventually it just works.
Yeah.
This is not a series like Hunter x Hunter where everything is very in-depth and explained and the entire system is something that is part of the entertainment value, I suppose. Toriyama doesn't like to focus on those things. He does seem to hint that these things exist. So whenever he references a lot of things, in Dragon Ball and Z and even in Super in some cases, he does seem to be referencing real-world understandings of what chi flow is and how that works. Whether it's something like Gohan talking about his inner core, or even if it's something the much derided tingly back thing that Caulifla had and Super, that seems to be alluding to something going on within how ki flows through the body that we would understand in real life. Toriyama doesn't like to go into it. I don't know whether that's because he feels like he doesn't have the full capability of fleshing out his world to that degree. We've seen him before go into S cells, and they got some blowback as a result because he started explaining something.
Yeah, like the midi-chlorian illusion, for example, that a lot of people didn't like that George Lucas went into.
Yes.
But when you really kind of tie into the greater ideas of the Force, or even how it works in Dragon Ball, it isn't necessarily contradictory.
But it is fitting for the narrative for them to not go into it because Dragon Ball is such a simple, easy to understand setting. And for people like us that are very analytical and logical and like to try to break things down like this, maybe we shouldn't be the kind of people writing Dragon Ball because it might easily turn into that sort of thing, and that's not what Dragon Ball is all about. So it's not something I'm going to complain about too much, but it is interesting to note that even the characters in Dragon Ball don't really seem to understand what they're doing most of the time.
Yeah, they're very natural to the point to where eventually the most powerful ability Goku gets is when that involves him not even thinking about anything. So
Exactly.
I think that's kind of a funny way of surmising everything. If we're looking at it kind of like magic systems, where one is like hard magic and one is soft magic, as a really good YouTuber, Shadiversity, broke down one time, I will say that Dragon Ball, even though it does have a little bit more hard aspects, is still kind of veering a little bit toward the soft magic aspect because so little of it is truly explained to us. It's more visual, and we're going to have to kind of interpret it in our own heads, or through head canon, as we like to call it, to get a better understanding and idea behind it.
Those things do exist, though, which is always the interesting thing about it to me, is that if you look at how everything, this is what this video is about, if you look at all the examples of how things occur in this setting, then you can piece together an idea of what Toriyama probably is thinking and how he understands and applies things in his own head. Maybe even without even really thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did talk about the weighted clothing. So this is something that Goku and Krillin start out using under Master Roshi's training during this period of time. And when they're doing this, they escalate over time as we see their overall strength is escalating as well, to where they go from wearing 20 kilogram shells to eventually wearing 40 kilogram. However, by the time the 21st tournament, for example, they're performing feats that are far greater than anything that just training under this type of weight would ever allow them to, where they could basically finger flick giants out of the ring and do things like that, which again, I think ties intrinsically into what you were discussing with regard to the power of ki, because realistically, if you look at it just as being super strength, by the time that Goku is fighting against Tien in the 23rd tournament, and he should be far more powerful than he was before, he's only training and fighting with As this version of the manga says 250 pounds in total, as this one says over 200 pounds.
In the anime, it states it as being total of 140 kilograms.
Yeah, so with regard to that, it definitely changes from version to version, but nonetheless, he's only really wearing 200 to 300-ish pounds overall, which, considering the fact that we saw Kid Goku pushing like a giant boulder while wearing weighted clothing, the same thing for Krillin, you'd think that they should theoretically be far stronger, unless this comes down again to ki and the way that they control it, and the real reason why they actually get a big workout out of wearing these clothes. Because unlike us, if we wear hundreds of pounds of clothing, we could barely move, and maybe it'll help strengthen us a little bit on top of destroying all our joints, as Jack's Blade pointed out in a video you guys can see in the top right corner. But within Dragon Ball, this is something that I think applies incredibly well to the ideas of training under higher gravity. So like, for example, when Goku goes to King Kai's planet, as we could see here in this manga panel, the second he gets there under the 10 times gravity, immediately he falls to the ground and can barely even stand up. And he's struggling to walk, to move, and to even follow after Bubbles, who has become totally like akin to an understanding and capable of mastering this type of gravity. At the same time, when we see him training under this gravity, we see that Goku actually is still wearing the weighted clothing simultaneously. Now, Goku is important to notice. He actually was a Saiyan born on a planet that has 10 times gravity, whether you want to call it Planet Vegeta, Planet Plant, or whatever have you. His people kind of developed under that gravity. Now, Goku, on his time on Earth, was not experienced to that gravity. So by the time he shows up on King Kai's planet, sure, when he takes off the weighted clothing, he's more capable of running around and stuff like that. But when he has both of them on simultaneously, this is an incredible struggle for him. So again, theoretically, based upon how much stronger Goku got when he was lifting cars at the start of Dragon Ball to when he goes to King Kai's planet, you'd think that he would be able to easily handle 10 times gravity, unless, of course, do you think maybe it's because of the fact that he has not yet truly experienced this type of training enough to where he can harness his ki to where he can withstand this?
Some of the point of this is that there is a seeming disparity with the use of weighted clothing and in regards to how much the characters can actually deal with. Even little Goku wearing a mere supposedly 20 kilograms while also pushing a rock that is obviously much, much heavier than that.
Yeah.
Would seem to be evidence of that. With all the cases of weighted clothing, whenever they actually mention how heavy these things are, they're not completely out of the realm of what an ordinary person could be able to support. It would not be reasonable in real life. With the aforementioned video that you made earlier, it's very bad for your joints, but it's still something that a normal human body could deal with to some degree. What we have sort of agreed on is that when ki surrounds your body, it is amplifying whatever is inside of that field. And normally that's just your body. So it's going to amplify whatever traits that you normally would have. So if you are someone that is very fast in, real life, if you had ki surrounding your body, then you would become someone that is supernaturally fast. Same thing with strength. The same thing can also apply to, say, Trunks' sword. Whenever he cuts right through Frieza. It's just seemingly an ordinary sword, but if he's surrounding it with his ki field, then it's amplifying the traits of whatever is inside of it. The same thing also will apply to weighted clothing. If weighted clothing is a mere 20 kilograms, then if you amplify it with your own ki field, then since you are moving within that field, then you're still going to experience the full strength of that 20 kilograms as though you were an ordinary person.
That makes perfect sense. It's like where Trunks, the true strength behind slicing and dicing through Frieza and his father, does not come from him having really strong biceps and triceps that he can cut through them, but it comes down to the fact that he extends that ki to his sword. He drapes it in that energy, very much like the characters when they have armor on. They're not just getting by based on the armor. It definitely can help, but they're draping it with their energy, with their force field, their ki barrier, as it's called. And thus, as a result, they're able to withstand it. And you talked about this in some of your other videos in the past, to where during a fight in Dragon Ball, characters are constantly trying to wear each other down with little attacks to break down their stamina, which makes them way more vulnerable over time, way more tired, and thus able to be defeated. And so A very similar idea, I think, applies to not only the weighted training, but also to the gravity training. And we actually, in terms of weighted training, we still see Goku using this method all the way up until the Buu Saga and then in Dragon Ball Super.
Yes.
So Goku, with this dead spiritual body in the afterlife, he's training under King Kai in the heavenly realm that we see here, the Grand Kai's planet in the anime. And we see that during this time, he has about 2 tons on each arm. Now, again, if everything was just like linear in terms of like their super strength, then 2 tons would not seemingly be that much, especially when Goku then has everything increased to 10 tons per arm. However, it's only when he's able to use Super Saiyan that he's able to control it. Now, I don't think this is because Goku becomes physically 50 times stronger. I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that Goku can do this because when somebody is using a Super Saiyan form or something like that, it makes raising their ki output to a certain degree much easier than if they're just in their base. So Goku is just, as we could see, his force field surrounds him in this, and when he's punching and kicking, he has the aura extended all around these weights. So I think that that's to indicate to us that Goku is not just powered up and so he has an aura, but rather the aura is actually serving the purpose of helping him more easily moving these high intensity weights that extend beyond his body, which normally, as we could see right here, in just his base form, he would be struggling to even move because of just how heavy these individual weights are.
Yes. You would think then, if wearing 20 kilograms on your body and then surrounding that with a ki field means that it still feels like 20 kilograms would naturally, then wouldn't that also apply to having 2 tons? So then if Goku was actually doing this correctly, wouldn't he just not be able to move at all? And we were discussing this, and we came up with this idea that the most likely reason why this is because there's different kinds of training when it comes to using gravity.
Yeah.
And when it comes to using weights. Because the effort of actually trying to perfectly reach an equilibrium with whatever force is being enacted on you is part of that training. So you can either be using that weight to train your body, which seemed to be the case early on in Dragon Ball, or it can be a case of using that weight to train your ability to have proper ki control so that you can actually keep using your ki field and to equalize that with the environment that you're in and also the force that's being enacted on you. Or it can be used to completely equalize everything so that you've reached full ki stability. You actually have complete control over not only yourself but also the environment as well. And that also applies to gravity chambers.
Absolutely, and I think that a perfect example of what you're saying is actually when Goku completes his training on Kaio's world near the end point of the first arc of Dragon Ball Z. We see that the biggest takeaways that Goku gets under training under the 10 times gravity and with the weighted clothing is not necessarily that his physical strength increases, but his ki control, to where he's not only able to master the ability to use the Genki Dama or Spirit Bomb, but then he's also able to use the Kaioken. The Kaioken, of course, which is an ability that King Kai himself was not actually able to master because of the strain on the body and also the incredible degree of ki control you need in order to use that ability. But after training under this higher gravity with the weighted clothing, Goku seems to have polished his ki control to such a degree that he could actually use an ability that even the creator himself of that ability cannot properly harness. So I think that's a perfect example that also ties into the first time we see Goku train under higher gravity. Now, when Goku goes to fly to Namek in order to take part in the entire conflict in that arc that's going on, he had Dr. Brief create for him a gravity chamber, as we could see here, that has the ability to go up to 100 gravitations, 100 Gs. And it says, according to him, that if Goku weighs 60 kilos under that, which is, a weight that people who know the metric system will be able to figure out much easier than me, then he would weigh 6,000 kilos or 6 tons under that, which is a massive amount of a weight increase comparative to what he weighed even on King Kai's planet, which would have been about 600 kilos. kilos. So with that in mind, we see that Goku, when he's training on his way there, he first whips on the gravity and goes to 20 times, and immediately we see him crouch down. He's like, oh, he's struggling so hard to even be able to withstand it, just walking around and doing push-ups and sit-ups. And immediately what he says is, I have to retrain myself starting from basics, or I'll never be able to withstand the higher levels of Kaioken. And again, Kaioken is something that relates directly to Goku's ability to be able to control his energy. At this point later on, we see him training under 100 times gravity, getting closer and closer to Namek. During this, he's exploiting the Zenkai boost to where he's strengthening his body, which also increases his capability to put out greater degrees of ki. And as Toriyama says right here in the narration, over and over, Goku trains until he nears his own demise, then eats a sensu bean in order to restore his strength. The 7 sensu beans given him by Karin are now down to only 3. Whether he realizes it or not, this kind of training greatly benefits him. As a Saiyan, Goku's strength increases each time he overcomes death, and we see this to where he leveled up to such a degree that he's actually using one hand to hold himself up like a Bruce Lee training method, and then when he actually turns down the gravity, he is so capable of controlling his energy and his ki that he just feels like he's so light. He's light as a feather, essentially. And now, according to him, I bet I could take a 10 times Kaioken, which we see him doing later on. So with regard to that, do you think that all comes down to Goku's increased ability to use the Kaioken times 10, then eventually times 20, down to the ki control he learned under the gravity, as opposed to it simply just being a biological effect on his body?
I definitely think that it is not biological, although with Dragon Ball, ki and life itself, and even the cases Genki can be found in things that are even inanimate.
Yeah.
So it's intrinsically linked with everything, so it's hard to separate the two of them. However, when it comes to training in general in Dragon Ball, there seem to be 3 fields that yield results. One is you're training your body, another is you're training your ki volume, the amount of ki that you actually can output, and the third would be your ki control. That is, your ability to stop ki from leaking out of your body, your ability to output it in short bursts and control the amount that you're actually creating as well. And that seems to be what Goku most benefited from during his training going to Namek, is because he was actually yielding so much training in terms of being able to control his ki field that translated into his ability to control the Kaioken.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very crucial component that a lot of people overlook because they just kind of view Goku as, well, he's 10 times physically stronger now, more durable under the gravitations that he's been incurring. But the entire time that he's under this, he has to control his ki, because realistically, if Goku had, turned off all of his external ki under this 100 times gravity, well, there's a strong chance that he wouldn't even be able to survive that encounter, because of the fact that he was struggling with even 10 times gravity not too long ago, because the physical capabilities can only go so far. And if I remember correctly, Toriyama has actually explained this in interviews in the past, that, for example, physical strength only takes you so far, so you have to focus on training your chi to increase, like you said, the volume, the output, and the capacity. I think another big reason why Goku is able to do a higher Kaioken is because he's trained his body to inherently be able to naturally put out that much higher of a degree. That's why Goku goes from being about, a power level of the low 300s to being able to increase his power to over 8,000 by the time he fights against Vegeta and Nappa, and also putting out that much higher of a power level with the regular Kaioken. However, because he hasn't trained himself to even higher degrees at this point, when he does the times 3 or times 4, or even on Namek the times 20, he wrecks his body because he can't normally put out that much energy. And even though he's doing it in kind of shorter bursts, it still is inherently too much for his physical being to withstand. And so as a result, if Goku tried to train under, let's say, 500 times gravity immediately, this probably would have been a massive struggle for him, despite the fact that, it would only be a 5 times jump comparative to the 10 times jump that he started with.
Something that we were joking about, I told you before we got started, I was afraid that this theory might turn into a sort of unified theory of everything when it comes to Dragon Ball, because so much goes into this. It relates to weighted clothing, the gravity chambers, Zenkai's power levels. Something I wanted to mention is that we see a lot of cases of weighted clothing being used throughout the series. And usually it's Piccolo, honestly, because that's part of his design, so he tends to take it off a lot. But each time that this happens and people remove their clothing, we see an increase in battle power. In the case of the Raditz fight, for example, Piccolo's power level goes from a 322 to a 408, and Goku's goes from a 334 to a 416. And Piccolo, that's an increase, I calculated this, 26.7%. And Goku had a 24.5% increase. So that relates to the weight that they're experiencing is actually lowering their battle power. And I took that to mean that it had something to do with the fact that so much of their ki was going into equalizing that force. And also you have it brought up here in Super, not that we're liberally drawing from Super too much for examples, but they were using these full body suits. And this is probably the most exaggerated form of weighted clothing training that we've ever seen in any of the series, to completely encase their bodies in this weight. And during the course of them doing this, they're able to move around quite liberally, to some degree at least. And the moment that they take them off, they just sink right into the ground. And it's way more overt in the anime as opposed to here in the manga. It literally just sinks into the core of the planet, because it's so incredibly heavy that the planet itself can't support it. Whereas if they are surrounding it with their ki fields, then it just feels like another part of them. And they're trying to equalize that force with the force of the world that they're on in comparison to their own bodies. Another example of this that I remembered is whenever Vegeta is fighting Pui Pui, I think his name is. He is told that the area that they're in has the same gravity as Pui's home planet, which is 10 times. And Vegeta, of course, says, "I don't even feel it." And you can actually see him bounding up and down as though gravity itself there is having no effect. Point being, he either is intentionally flying slightly to mock him, which I don't think, or his ki field is actually extending down and around him enough that the local environment that he's sitting in is actually equalized to the point that it feels like normal gravity to him. And it's having the same force that it would on Earth.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. Like, first off, the point that you made about how when they take the clothing off, as we could even see in this manga panel in Super, and then in the show, it's the exact same way, where when they're wearing the clothing, they're not sinking into the ground, even though they should be if the weight is exactly the same when they take it off versus when they have it on. And even when Goku has the majority of it taken off right here, same thing with Vegeta, there's so much less of their body that should be holding it up and supporting it. So it only makes sense that they have developed their ki to such a degree. And Vegeta himself, I feel like, is the one that would probably have even greater control under these higher gravities, because not only did he live for longer on planet Vegeta, but additionally, we see him using gravity training far more than even Goku. And not only does he train under 300 times gravity during the 3-year time skip leading up to the fight with the different androids at the time, but not just that, the thing is, he says that he could take 3 times as much as Goku when he is far more powerful at this point in terms of just basic power level compared to the 90,000 that Goku had when he arrived on Namek. But not just that, he's struggling under the gravity. In the anime, it's so much further where he almost, dies in the process of it. And not just that, but later on, which I think also ties into how the general ki power works, we see Vegeta in the Buu Saga training in the gravity room alongside Trunks. Now, when Vegeta is in here, he makes out the point that it's 150 times gravity. And yet, despite the fact that it makes sense that this would be really tough for Trunks, who hasn't really, adapted to this type of gravity yet and using his ki, so he could barely move, with Vegeta, he's still getting a very clearly good workout. We could see him sweating. We see that this is tough for him. And just like with Goku, when we see him using the weighted clothing, Trunks powers up right here into Super Saiyan and can easily run around and make it easy to where he's actually able to fight against Vegeta and even land a blow on his face in the process. So I think that the reason why Vegeta is getting a good workout isn't just because he's punching and kicking a lot, but also because at this point Vegeta has mastered Super Saiyan. So he's able to, with the grade 4, maybe lower his amount of ki output to such a degree to where, let's say if we were to compare visually or, for deep sea divers, for example, the further down the ocean you go, the further the pressure is on your body, to where if you go down to where a submarine is, you'll be crushed instantly. And so Vegeta, maybe to get a greater workout despite being a Super Saiyan, despite being far more powerful than he was when he first started training under 300 times gravity, training in 150 times will still give him a significant workout and help him to develop that key muscle, as it were, to make it to where his key control is that much greater.
Yes. This scene in particular is fairly interesting for a lot of reasons. First off, I mentioned the reason why this scene is structured the way it is because Toriyama wanted the joke of Trunks becoming a Super Saiyan and it surprising Vegeta.
Yeah.
So having Vegeta start as a Super Saiyan made more sense. On one level, you can't read too much into it, but at the same time, it does make some degree of sense if you start applying this logic to it. You would think that if Trunks turns Super Saiyan and suddenly it's very easy for him to move around, then why would Super Saiyan Vegeta be having any workout at all?
Yeah.
And I think it just comes down to that. Is one, Super Saiyan itself inherently is somewhat unstable, unless you get to grade 4. So there are many different kinds of training that you can undergo while you're inside of a gravity chamber. With Vegeta, it seems like what he's doing is exactly as you said. It's like deep sea diving. He is lowering his ki output so that he is meeting the requirements of existing in this room without the gravity affecting him in any way, while also mediating that with the instability of Super Saiyan itself. So the output that Trunks is generating whenever he turns Super Saiyan is probably greater than that of what Vegeta is bothering to use at the time. It's sort of like training with the right amount of weight, doing an exercise that you're normally used to doing without any weights at all.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense too. It's kind of like a point I made in another video I probably mentioned earlier, in which I had discussed how, if you go from lifting like 10 pounds on a bar when you're doing the bench press to, suddenly having 2 plates on either side, that's going to be a massive change. And if you're not used to it, your body isn't configured through your musculature in the way to where you can handle that, then you're going to have a problem. But like you said, Trunks probably doesn't have Super Saiyan mastered anywhere near the same degree as Vegeta, so we could see even like his aura is shooting out in all these jagged ways compared to Vegeta's, which is far more smooth. So whether that's something that Toriyama intentionally wanted to convey or not, I think that plays perfectly into the point you just made.
Yes. Something else that we're going to have to go into to some degree are going to be the nature of how power levels interact with each other.
Yeah.
Because that also relates to the gravity chamber itself, in a way, being an opponent. Something that I mentioned to you very early on is in the fight against Raditz. Goku fires his Kamehameha at Raditz, and Raditz is at first running away. He suddenly decides to turn and to cancel it out. And we see this a few times. Another good example of that would be Goku using his times 20 against Frieza.
Yeah.
They collide, and effectively Frieza takes no real substantial damage. And it seems like whenever two opponents have completely equal power levels, they just cancel each other out and nothing really happens. But if you are able to do what Earth Fighters do, or at least early on in Dragon Ball Z, and compress your power level into a single point, it raises that battle power and allows you to hit over your head in a sense. And supposedly, throughout most of the history of the universe, most elite fighters had a power level of around like 10 to 20,000, with some mutants, like those in the Ginyu Force, being able to go up near around the range of about 100,000.
Yeah.
With Frieza, of course, being what he is, so outlandishly above that, it's inconceivable.
Literally 1,000 times stronger than his most powerful soldier at the time.
Yes. So whenever these elite soldiers that did not know, generally, Ginyu seemed to suggest that he could, how to raise their battle powers unnaturally in the way that Earth's fighters could, whenever they came up against an opponent that had a higher battle power than them, then it just naturally occurred to them, I just lost. Like, there's no way for me to compete, because they can't raise their battle power enough to be able to do any actual substantive damage to their opponent. whereas their opponent can just stand there and take it and nothing happens to them. And it isn't until you're able to start doing that, to raise your battle power above what its resting state is, that you can actually do that in short bursts in order to wear someone down over time that's stronger than you are, assuming that your actual fighting technique is better than theirs.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my video about if Goku and Piccolo fought each other at the start of Dragon Ball Z, which you can also check out in the top right corner, I talked about how it's likely because of what the point you just made, how only characters like on Earth, like Goku and Piccolo, can seemingly augment their power to being able to put out far more with certain types of attacks like the Kamehameha or possibly Super Kamehameha that Goku uses after the 23rd tournament and Piccolo's Makanko Sapo. What ends up occurring is that, so Raditz, when he fires an attack, it's always going to be either at his level of power, like the 1200, or below that. Same thing with pretty much everyone, the Frieza Force. And many of them, they have to use like weapons that are like wristbands that fire blast because they can't even normally do it. So when it comes to Vegeta, he's able to easily destroy Qui despite them having a really kind of small difference between their overall powers, where Vegeta has a 20,000 and Kiwi only has a 18,000 at that point.
And Kui freaks out.
Yeah, and so he basically one-shots him with one of his attacks, which kind of goes to further prove that idea. And also you touched upon something before, which has the idea of possibly the Saiyan's body viewing gravity itself as an opponent. Now, I don't remember if I touched upon this at all in that video you guys can see in the top right where I discussed how Zenkai boosts work in Dragon Ball, but nonetheless, that's kind of the way that I've always interpreted it, because Goku is out in the middle of space. And so as a result, he doesn't really have a powerful key signature he's necessarily sensing, unless maybe he's sensing everything on Earth. And so as a result, what is the active threat at the time that is boosting Goku's power to essentially being 10 times greater than it was when he went into this gravity chamber to begin with? That I feel like would have to be the force of gravity itself. So very akin to feeling the power of someone when you're healing and regenerating, you too are also feeling the power of the environment that you're within. So as a result, that's why I feel like Saiyans adapted so easily to the 10 times gravity on Planet Plant when they came there. And additionally, I also think that that's why Goku was able to get so powerful, because not only was he training himself to be able to match up to this, but Toriyama specifically mentions how he was getting several Zenkai boosts along the way. And so I think that the body itself adapted to the 10 times greater threat than he was experiencing at the time, which was the gravity itself, which also probably explains why his boost was so significant during that period of time.
Yes. You made a video, how do Zenkai boosts work? And you probably already linked it up the top right, but that took a load off my shoulders because I was really worried about having to also go over all of that. But you explained that very thoroughly in that video, so that should be enough. But I am in agreement with you. You call it the active threat theory, I believe. Usually I refer to it as just like acclimation or emulating or adaptive key or something like that. The idea, of course, being that if you are much weaker and you come across, say, Frieza, and he's fighting at a battle power of 1,000,000 at the time in his second form, then, especially if you're Vegeta, in this case, if you take damage and you get healed, then your battle power can then readapt itself back to whatever it felt at the time. So you can quickly raise your battle power in a way that you never could before by experiencing it from another person or from, in this case, a gravity chamber. And I feel that that's what's actually going on with the gravity chamber. It effectively is turning itself into an opponent because you're having to adapt the way that you structure your own ki in order to equalize that force against whatever your body happens to be, because that's just how ki works. You're trying to amplify whatever is inside that field, like a pressure suit, to survive in whatever environment you happen to be inside of.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing, too, that goes back to the idea of key control is, if we want to touch on Super one more time, is even as of the Universe 6 tournament and then Goku Black and so on and so forth, we do continue to still see Goku and Vegeta utilizing seemingly low levels of gravity and training that would be nothing to them at this point, like the hyperbolic time chamber, where Goku and Vegeta go inside of it, both of them start to utilize their Super Saiyan Blue, and yet they're training effectively, and they get a rather sizable boost as far as we're conveyed, especially in the anime version, while doing this. For Super Saiyan Blue, who even knows what the multiplier at this point is? 10 billion, who knows, something crazy like that. But the fact of the matter is that when they are controlling their energy, especially in a form like Super Saiyan Blue, that when it was initially introduced was really energy draining and sapping, it seems far more beneficial to use it under, again, something like the higher gravity, very similar to what Vegeta did in the Buu saga, where he was using Super Saiyan under this so that he could get a greater grasp on the key control and the necessity of using that in this form, which in turn makes the form that much more viable to use later on.
Something that Vegeta does say in Super is that they've already pushed their bodies as far as they can possibly get them. So at this point, what matters more is their ability to have proper key output and control. And that's one of the things that I believe it's in a superhero. Whenever they're starting their fight, he focuses more on making sure that he's not wasting his ki as opposed to just trying to get stronger and stronger like Goku was unfortunately doing at the time.
Yeah.
And I have a vague memory of Toriyama also stating this in an interview at the end of Z, is that he had this idea that they had reached their physical limits, although I couldn't find it. I wanted a citation on it, but I couldn't find it before the video got started. But I do remember that as well. So does seem to be a recurring idea with Toriyama whenever he's doing his writing, that at this point in their development, their bodies are their bodies, and there's nothing more that they can do to them. Saiyans stay in their peak as far as fighting shape is concerned until their 80s, I believe it is.
Yeah, it says
and
right
that's
here,
whenever they start to go downhill. So they're going to be at their peaks for a long time. So their only method of improvement at this point is going to be doing what they're doing here and using Super Saiyan or changing how they use their ki to adapt to their environment and themselves while also trying to do their basic training. And that's what's actually giving them more control, that sort of key muscle memory in a sense, of being able to adapt themselves very quickly in any circumstance to any environment that they happen to be in and against any opponent.
So are there any other points that you feel like we should probably cover, or do you think we've kind of hit on them? Because I think we've already given a very thorough explanation for how we believe that works.
Yeah. But that's me. Like I told you before, this is probably a video that I was actually planning on making, and they just so happened to coincide. I'll probably do something that's more comprehensive in terms of like going into every single little bitty thing, but
yeah,
I think we've covered most of that. The point, of course, is that when you put it all together, gravity and weight seem to train you in 3 different ways. When you wear weights outside of your body, you can either put them inside or outside of your ki field. Weights that are on the inside feel like they're normal weights, even if they're absurdly heavy, like Goku's otherworld, training weights. Weights that are outside of your ki are only effective if they're absurdly heavy in terms of training your ki volume.
Yeah.
And there you could do both at the same time. Like in this example, we were wondering what exactly is going on here. He can't possibly be feeling this if it's that heavy. It doesn't matter what material it is.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what if he's actually extending his ki field through the rope and onto this cube? And instead of it being a physical training method, it's actually him trying to train his ability to extend his own ki field outside of his own body.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense.
There are many different kinds of training that Toriyama's not going to go into that you could project onto this as your own headcanon, that he's actually undergoing that do make sense, that would be very beneficial. A lot of that just comes down to external forces, whether that is an actual literal opponent or if it's gravity, in the case of a weighted clothing, or an actual chamber that is controlling all the gravity around you.
Yeah, for sure. And so as a result, I believe that we've demonstrated in this video exactly how we believe that gravity training and many of these other types of weighted training and just training in general work, to where the biggest factor it comes down to is ki control. And while they are certainly pushing their bodies to their limits, eventually the mastery and control and the augmentation of that ki is what allows them to excel beyond any types of other boundaries. And one more question I do want to ask before we go actually is, do you think that's even necessary for the characters to get up to, I don't know, neutron star levels or black hole levels of gravity? Or do you think that because of the level of ki control at this point, they don't actually need that anymore, and rather will be able to instead simply just use the same levels of gravity, but continually lowering their energy to where it still will reduce or control and contribute the same mass strain?
The narrative, Dragon Ball is about power levels and escalation. So I imagine that will always be the case. They'll always keep inexplicably getting stronger, of course. Nothing wrong with that. I also feel like they could, in theory, lower their ki output to the point where they are training just trying to suppress themselves, and that's another form of training. You can do anything with ki. Something I'd like to point out is that power levels seem to be logarithmic in a sense.
Yeah.
Whenever Toriyama first came up with the concept of power levels, he went back and started applying them to fights that were in Dragon Ball. Like Tien versus Goku was a good example because their fight was so even, they had completely even power levels. So I think it was 180.
Yeah.
Just to exhibit just how even and that conflict was. Whereas as you go on, differences in the millions don't really matter. So in the case of increasing gravity returns, I imagine if you are training instead of in a gravity chamber of times 500 or whatever, and if you're fighting in the middle of a collapsing star, then maybe the benefit of actually training that way is still there, but not as pronounced as it would have been if you were jumping from times 1 to times 10.
Yeah, for sure. And with regard to all of that, I think that this is the time for you guys to let us know your thoughts down below in the comments. Let us know how you think this all works. And also, of course, make sure to check out Plague of Gripes, as you can see in the end screen popping up. A lot of great content on there. Definitely worth checking out.
A lot of suspicious content.
Those other videos you're coming out with in the future. And yeah, also make sure to leave a like, share this video out, subscribe if you're new here so you can stay up to date with all my future videos. Check out those cards in the top right. I love to point to that. And also, make sure to stick around because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.